We're getting ready to start the first of our afternoon panels on William Bartram's relationship with Indians and slaves on the St. Johns River. That's going to be moderated by Charlotte Porter, Dr. Charlotte Porter, who many of you know and have enjoyed here in Florida before. We'll also ask Bill to come up here and make our preface to the panel for us.
One of my true pleasures was meeting the local peoples of the St. Johns. I drew my friend Schluko, the Long Warrior, to help me sell my book, Travels. About 9 years previous, I tried to establish a plantation about 60 miles downstream from here, north of Fort Piccolata. My father sent me 6 slaves to help with the labor. It was not successful. Slavery and farming is not in my nature. The Indians named me Pugpuggy, the flower hunter, which I appreciate. I was asked by them to dispatch a rattlesnake very near here and became their hero. I ventured out west to visit their capital in Cuskawilla, where I met the cowkeeper and was treated with great kindness. And I witnessed the frolic at the trading house near here. This festival exhibited one of the most ludicrous bacchanalian scenes that is possible to be conceived. White and red men and women without distinction passed the day merrily with these jovial, amorous toppers and nights of convivial songs, dances, and sacrifices to Venus. As long as they could stand or move. And just before my departure, after the predatory band of Seminoles, under the conduct of the Long Warrior, had decamped, Mr. Emlach invited me with him on a visit to an Indian town right here. We were received and entertained hospitably by the Indians. The chief of the village conducted us to a grand airy pavilion in the center of the village. Being seated or reclining ourselves after smoking tobacco, baskets of choicest fruits were brought and set before us. I respected and admired these peoples.
Panel is entitled William Bartram's Relationships with Indians and Slaves on the St. Johns River. I'm Charlotte M. Porter, a Bartram author and scholar, a historian of science, recently retired from the University of Florida. This panel will look at another aspect of the Bartram Trail. We've had some other panels that have enjoyed sharing with us his ideas about natural communities, plant and animal communities. This panel will bring in the human community and will, I think, finish Tom Hollick's sentence. He was talking about taking away some of the sentiment from Bartram's writing. This group will also look at economic communities. You can't often talk about humans in interaction and trade interactions without really facing or exploring an economic dimension. Our first speaker today is Catherine Braunt. Professor Braunt is the Holyfield Professor of History at Auburn University. She will be speaking on the Congress of Piccolata, 1765. There's that word, economy and politics in British East Florida. Our second speaker is Dr. Patricia Riles-Whitman, who will be speaking on cultural sovereignty in the midst of war, Indians and Blacks in the Bartram era. Dr. Whitman is recently set up shop in Tallahassee. You can look up her Whitman Historical Services there. For many years, she worked with the Seminole tribe in South Florida, and I would say has had a very meaningful historical career. Our last speaker is Steve Hale. Dr. Hale has an anthropology degree from the University of Florida, and he will be speaking to us about Cowkeeper and the Long Warrior. We've seen the Long Warrior's images throughout the program today, and those of you that have the tote bag will be taking his face home with you. Please welcome Catherine Braunt.
It's such a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Can everyone hear me? And I have come to know and love Sam Carr and Dean and several others in the Palatka community. You've done so much for Bartram and heritage tourism and education, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And now I'm going to commit 2 heresies. First of all, I'm going to read because I have a lot of quotes, and Charlotte read me the riot act about staying to time, so I think I do that best if I read. And secondly, I'm going to focus not so much on William Bartram, who was at the Congress, but John Bartram. And we are 250 years and a very important anniversary for this Congress. So let me read. November 15th, 1765. It was a lovely, cool day. The wind was out of the northwest. Never, declared John Bartram, who was the King's expeditionary botanist, was there a finer day to travel. And travel he did that day, setting out from St. Augustine, East Florida, when the sun was just 1 hour high. Bartram and his son William rode with a number of other gentlemen, and they were traveling to Piccolata, a paltry watchtower along the St. Johns River where East Florida Governor James Grant, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs John Stewart, and an impressive delegation of Creek Indians had gathered to renew their alliance and agree on a boundary line. The Congress of Piccolata was one of 5 such conferences held in the South at the end of the 7 Years' War to establish peaceful relations and negotiate boundaries between the British and the neighboring Indian tribes. And this is a little drawing from a map. And this is a redone thing. You can see a little better. Grant and Stewart arrived before Bartram and his party, and they had been escorted to this outpost earlier by the Royal Artillery and the 9th Regiment of Foot. The 9th Regiment's most impressive enlistee, at least from my perspective, was Lieutenant William Sharp. For William Sharp either produced for himself, or more likely commissioned, a commemorative engraved powder horn detailing the events at Piccolata that beautiful November 250 years ago. And I must say the 9th Regiment was known for producing a number of impressive powder horns. They had some really good engravers, and it was high art. But you have the official records of the Congress, you have the writings of a botanist, and you have an engraved powder horn to tell us exactly what was going on just down the river all that time ago. Well, there were 2 main issues that the British and the Lower Creek Indians had to address at this conference: land and trade. And here's the thing that most people don't realize, because everyone thinks the British got East Florida, but the Creeks owned Florida by right of conquest under international law, and that was recognized by the British. And as well-armed allies of Great Britain, they had virtually destroyed the indigenous tribes of Florida and their Spanish allies by the time the territory was officially turned over to Great Britain at the end of the war. So the prime purpose of the conference, from the British perspective, was to get a peacefully negotiated boundary line between Creek and British lands. And here is the map of the 18th century South. This is really based on one that came out of the Southern Indian Office. And to show you where the Creeks were, we are, of course, down here. The Creek Nation is up here in 2 parts, the upper towns in what is now Alabama and the lower towns who are up and down the Chattahoochee River. And so they're quite a bit of ways from East Florida. And they were, in fact, empire builders. The tribes who were actually here were considered to be part of the Lower Creek Nation. And there were a number of these little towns and settlements as far south as Tampa Bay. There were hunting camps in the Everglades that were Creeks, and they had taken over here and there former mission village sites and Indian towns, all the way from modern Gainesville, the Alachua Savannah, to the Appalachian Mission site of San Luis at what's modern Tallahassee, the Creek word for Newtown, Tallahassee. So these small settlements were already beginning to acquire a new designation in Creek geopolitics. They were loosely known as the Seminoles by this time. But all creeks, from both the upper and lower creek towns, were enriched by the abundant game and resources of Florida. The region had become, in fact, a gigantic creek hunting preserve. From the Creek point of view, Britain had merely inherited the tidal lands to which the Spanish had been so effectively restricted by Creek warriors during most of the 18th century. These coastal lands were, as John Bartram dryly recorded, poor for agriculture. They're sandy soils. But the Creeks were not inclined to part with the more fertile interior savannas. As John Stuart reported to his superiors, the Creeks were tenacious of their lands and even disposed to be refractory, or to use John Bartram's more precise summations, the Creeks had grown saucy because of their military success. Now, trade issues were multifaceted. Creek wealth and power rested on the ready availability of British manufactured goods, especially weapons and textiles. And the Indian trade was an essential component to colonial economies. The British were eager to expand Indian trading stores, hoping to grow the economy of the new East Florida colony. And so everything had to work together. The trade was also Britain's premier diplomatic tool, because if you control people by trade and you have their access to weapons, you can ensure peaceful relations and vice versa, so you don't want your settlements attacked. For their part, the Creeks liked the convenience of local stores, and they were also hoping that the new stores established in East Florida would provide better exchange rates for their produce. Things like deer skins, sacks of honey they were collecting in Florida by that time, and even fresh meat for the settlers. So there you go, as you can see. This is a map from later on, but it gives you a really good idea of where these town sites were and where we are in relation to everything. And we'll come back to this map. So who came? Well, in all, there were 31 headmen and their followers representing 13 Lower Creek towns who attended this Congress. The leading spokesman was Talichi of Okmulgee, the great beloved man of the Lower Creeks, and he was the chief speaker. Yowiliwiani, or Captain Alec of Casita, was the second major speaker. And these two represented their respective town tribal divisions in the Lower Creeks. One spoke for the Peace or White towns, and the other for the Red towns. It's a division that extends across the Creek Nation. Neither were residents of East Florida, and yet they are representing the voice of the Creek Nation to the British here. All of these headmen were from these established Creek mother towns located on the Chattahoochee River. Only two Seminole towns, including Alachua, were represented at the Congress. Like Bartram's, the Creeks had come from afar because the nearest Chattahoochee town was nearly 400 miles distant from St. Augustine. So this is power projection at its finest on the part of the Creek Nation. No headmen from the upper towns, the Alabama towns, attended because under the way that the Creeks manage their land, it's the Chattahoochee towns who control all this land in Florida and eastward toward the boundary with Georgia. The Upper Creek towns, they negotiate with the British in Pensacola for the Gulf side of things, all the way to the Tensaw and up into Tennessee. So that's how the Creeks divided their land holding things. And I might say, since the Upper Creeks had no authority about who could give land here, these little Seminole towns, if we just go ahead and call them Seminoles now for the sake of convenience, they had no say either. They are under the dominion of these powerful headmen on the Chattahoochee. Now, when you get to the conference, there are official conference proceedings, and they're very dry. They're composed of speeches by the governor and the superintendent, and they note that the peace pipe was smoked in addition to other usual ceremonies, which isn't something a historian wants to see. You want detail. Fortunately, John Bartram's botanical diary provides some of the missing details about the Congress, which opened November 15th and concluded 3 days later. And I think the powder horn goes with Bartram's diary so nicely because it illustrates many of the activities that took place. Now, as the guns from Fort Picolata boomed, Superintendent Stewart, Governor Grant, and the official secretary took their seats in the shade of a brush arbor or pavilion to receive the Creeks, and this was constructed in the Creeks architectural style. The pavilion itself was roughly 23 feet by 10 feet. The roof was made of pine branches, and pine branches also formed the rear of the structure. There were low side walls topped with 2 poles wrapped around with blankets that served as bench seating for the Indians. And I think you can get a sense of the arbor from the little diagram on the powder horn. With Grant and Stewart seated and ready to receive the Creeks, the opening ceremonies began as about 50 Indians assembled some 150 yards from the table, lined up in a column, 6 abreast, and marched toward the pavilion, performing in slow, measured steps a ceremonial dance. On one side of this column of 6 men abreast were 2 Indians who carried specifically very finely dressed deer skins for presentation as ritual gifts to the governor and superintendent. Talichi and Captain Alec, the leading speakers, carried rattle boxes and pipes dressed with eagle feathers, and they marched on the other side of the column. They were accompanied by one of their interpreters because none of them spoke English, except the interpreter, of course. The rattle mentioned by Bartram was no doubt a gourd rattle containing small stones. Now, John Bartram was amazed by this, and he described the beloved dance in detail. And here's what he said. The Indians marched with an easy pace, sometimes dancing, singing, and shouting, and every now and then halting. But when they came within 20 paces of the pavilion, they halted for 4 or 5 minutes. Then the 2 leading chiefs advanced pretty fast with a kind of dance to the governor and superintendent, who they stroked over their face and head with eagle feathers. Then the headmen slowly retreated backward, dancing to the entrance of the pavilion. Then they returned to the column, which was still halted, and said a few words to the men there. Then they advanced again with an easy pace to the governor and superintendent, who stood up and shook hands with them. Taking someone hand in hand is an incredible mark of peace. We all know about handshakes, but it's called the hand in hand in Indian diplomacy. Now, Sharp's powder horn portrays Indian women performing an Indian beloved dance, and I'll say more about these ladies later. Those performing at the Congress ceremony were they were all men. The women were not involved in the official ceremony, but there were opportunities for Indian women to have participated in the dances during the evening after the business of the Congress was complete. Sharp's horn does accurately portray not only the clothing styles fashionable among the Creek ladies of the period, but also their characteristic double bun hairstyle as well. And I might add that one interesting thing that if you study this and another of the little images of the women on the thing, and these would have been the wives of leading men, and you notice they have very modern looking clothing. That's what they wore, short skirts and these bodices that were very low cut. But you can also see, particularly on this lady, how the waist cuts in. She's wearing a corset. No doubt a present she received at the end of this Congress. So these are very well-dressed, very fashionable women. But it's very obvious, not always on this one, but on a couple of the other little images on the horns, that they are wearing those imported corsets to get that body shape. So once the dance was complete, Talichi and Captain Alec took their places on one on each end of the pavilion, with the interpreter standing 2 or 3 yards from the chiefs. And the 2 leading chiefs sat down, and the other headmen came in groups of 2 to 4, shaking hands with Grant and Stewart. And when they'd all paid their respects, the Indian burdeners presented those deerskins to the British delegations. And it was then that they smoked the peace pipe. Now, interestingly, the horn shows this ceremony, and it has a European between 2 Indians, and he appears to be, pointing or looking toward the what we would think of as the pipe bowl, but actually that's a very interesting and quite new trade item that was invented in America during the 7 Years' War, and it's known as a pipe hatchet or a pipe tomahawk. And when you that is the business end of a hatchet, and when you hold it down, literally you can do no harm. You are holding the symbolic weapon down when you smoke the peace pipe. So it was a very popular part of Indian diplomacy along the Atlantic coast during the 7 Years' War. I think it was actually came out of Philadelphia that the first pipe tomahawks were identified. In any case, that's a really wonderful scene from the powder horn, and this one is even better. in my point of view. It shows the delegates in all their splendor wearing the textiles and clothing they had obtained through the trade. You can see them in striped and checked linen jackets and wool coats. They have wool leggings, and they would have been either red or blue leggings, white shirts. The checks would have been in red and so forth. And even the typically deformed earlobes of fashionable young men wrapped with brass wire are evident here, and they have these tunics. And they have glass beads. Now, the most interesting thing about this little vignette is the guy with the hat. Who can tell me what kind of hat that is? It's a Quaker hat. All right, show of hands. Is this John Bartram or William Bartram? Who votes for John? Who votes for William? Don't you think William would be the one sitting with the Indians? It's got to be. That's got to be John or William, one or the other. Take your pick. Okay. Though considered curiosities by those who attended the Congress, the ceremonial introduction dance, the rattle music, the ritual use of purifying tobacco, even the handshakes, were essential components of Creek diplomacy, which was very measured and very ritualistic. But once those ceremonies were complete, the dirty deal making got done, okay, and the speech making commenced. Now, the governor delivered a very long opening oration, which you can tell by the way John Bartram describes it, he thought was long and boring. And it was, so I'm not going to repeat it. Let's just say that Stuart followed with briefer remarks, much to the same effect. And there was a short reply by the Indians, and then the Congress closed. But the big deal was the Indians would not give. The British wanted a lot of land for East Florida. Grant wanted land for his new colony. He was a pushy, ambitious man. He wanted to succeed. And the Creeks stood firm. They said they considered as their boundary lands up the river as far as the tide ran, and that's a boundary that was severely limited the colony. And maybe Dan can tell us where that actually was as far as the, but it's not much. So that evening, Stuart and Grant went to work behind the scenes, gaining over some of the headmen of note with the help of the interpreters. Grant, in no uncertain terms, threatened to withhold the trade goods he held in presence from the Indians, which included things that they had been allowed to see, and they knew they were going to be very adequately compensated for their land. He said, no land, no deal, no presents, you know. And what he did then was take out a very large map of the boundary he thought was appropriate and told them, you go figure out when you're going to give me this amount of land, and dismiss them, not even inviting them to dinner with him, which is a really serious breach of diplomatic etiquette. In any case, it worked because the next day, the Creeks did agree to extend the boundary westward past the St. Johns River a little bit. It was, according to John Bartram, a fine concession of above 25 miles deep and several hundred miles in length, as much or more than the governor expected. And you can see it here on Lou Divorcey's wonderful map. And you can also see the other area that Grant was trying to go after later, but he didn't get. But here's the boundary line right there. So with Creek capitulation on the land issue, the negotiations ended. So the Creeks are ostensibly losers, but they really got what they wanted because the British would settle in Florida. They would become more accessible trade partners. The lower store and the upper store are evidence of that. More importantly, the British had recognized and respected Creek ownership of Florida, expanding their limits by negotiation and purchase rather than by force, the ugly diplomatic tricks aside. Moreover, they were willing to agree to what would seem to be very reasonable boundaries and left the vast interior, including Alachua and Appalachia, to the Creeks. And everybody knows that's the best part of Florida, right? The St. John's back. So on the whole, not a bad deal for the Creeks, keeping in mind that their center of power was 400 miles away. Well, the Congress wasn't completely over because on November 18th, they actually signed the treaty, and Stuart presented the leading Indians with silver medallions as rewards for their loyalty to Great Britain. 4 of the leading Indians were made great metal chiefs, signifying their seniority, and 4 were honored with small medals. The investiture was not really an appointment. The British didn't say, let's take the 4 Indians that'll be nicest to us. What they were doing was recognizing established Creek leadership. And among those so honored was the face you've come to know so well, the lone warrior, and shown here in Bartram's portrait. He got a small medal. Now, John Bartram's diary is one of the few records we have that describes the medals. Bartram wrote that they were fine silver medals, some as big as the palm of my hand, and others bigger than a $1 coin. The medals were suspended from silk ribbons and hung around the headmen's necks by Stuart. And we actually this is a second powder horn. There are actually 3 powder horns I've identified. The one I'm mainly showing you, Sharp's horn, is in Ontario, believe it or not. It followed a British Army officer's family to Canada, where they eventually settled. This one is privately owned by a corporate collector. And you can see this on this other powder horn is meant to show the medal ceremony there, and they have these little medals. And I'm sure the same hand produced both these powder horns. We do have copies of the actual George III peace medals, and you see they are quite impressive. So, after the ceremony, Stuart and Grant shook hands with each chief, and the Congress officially closed. And over the next several days, valuable presents of guns, kettles, hose, blankets, and cloth were distributed to the Indians, representing payment for the land purchase, but they were always called presents by the British. John Bartram did not mention it, and here you can see a really good shot of these ladies wearing corsets, and I'm sure they were passing out corsets during the present list. But rum was also distributed as well, and you can see the result. Stuart and Grant were very pleased with their successful negotiations, and the Lower Creeks returned to their hunting grounds just as pleased because, according to the terms of the treaty, they were going to continue to hunt on the ceded lands until it was settled by the English. Now there's the rub, because, as we know, the British were notoriously slow about settling that area. John and William Bartram, of course, having made the acquaintance of leading Indians and their interpreters, set off on their famous expedition of the St. John's River. William Bartram, enamored with becoming a Florida settler, remained here after his father returned to Philadelphia and lost his share of his father's estate on a failed Florida plantation. And I think in many ways, William's experience is a mirror reflecting the failed expectations of both Governor Grant and other land speculators eager for profit in Florida. For in the end, the land they got from the creeks at Piccolata counted for very little. Grant repeatedly postponed marking the new boundary line, hoping to get more land before he actually put a marked line on the sand, and they did that by blazing trees and clearing the land and so forth, because he was convinced once you mark it, the Indians will never give us more. So he always delayed marking it. Meanwhile, he did grant and cause to be surveyed millions of acres of non-ceded Indian land, but it came to nothing. The British were abysmal failures at actually settling East Florida until right on the eve of the Revolution, when a lot of refugees came in. In the 20 years they held the province, they did not even begin to rival the early success of the Spanish. William Bartram's East Florida experience, I think, was the rule rather than the exception. British East Florida, as much as anything else, remained a creek hunting preserve, no matter what the treaty line said. For the Creeks and their Seminole brethren, and this is a full view of that beautiful horn, Florida would remain theirs for a time, eventually becoming the last refuge in their retreat from American aggression and forced removal in the 19th century. And I think it's fitting justice that the boundary negotiated at Piccolata was never surveyed nor marked. Indeed, it was not until the modern Seminole Indians filed suit against the United States government in 1950, asserting that they owned Florida under the terms of the 1765 Treaty of Piccolata, that the line was finally delineated and marked on a map. When one considers the conference on its own, it's really noteworthy as a window on Creek ceremony. When considered in light of other Congresses, and there were 5 other Congresses during this period with the Creeks, it becomes the more remarkable. For in those Congresses, held as a result of the proclamation of 1763, which called for the establishment of marked boundaries between Indian and British territory, the Creek people embarked upon a singular task, that of establishing negotiated, marked, permanent boundaries. By 1774, they thought they had succeeded, locking in territorial conquest earned through over 100 years of war, literally doubling the size of their domain. For the Creeks, the boundaries they crafted were meant, to use the words of one leading chief, to be like a stone wall, never to be broke, to be like a tree, not to climb over. Though the boundary created by the Creek headmen between 1763 and 1773 was far from a stone wall that kept white settlements at bay, the efforts of 18th century leadership had formed a new sense of nationhood based not merely on town and tribal identity, but on territorial limits. Lower and upper towns, as well as Seminole satellite towns, working with 3 British colonies and 3 neighboring Indian tribes, crafted a Creek national territory on the basis of Creek diplomatic success. And I think their efforts represented a triumph of consensus and traditional town leadership, as well as innovation, as ancient patterns of governing encountered new opportunities and perils, and these diverse and dispersed towns found a way to take ancient town governments and craft them into an effective national institution working toward a single goal, and that was the establishment and preservation of the Creek people. Thank you.
Let me begin by adding my thanks to all of you who worked so very hard to make this conference a reality, to bring it to fruition. And I'm particularly pleased, and I want to thank you for having included this panel, because it gives us the opportunity to look at other facets of William Bartram's story, and in our cases, the story of the people whom he met here, the earliest Floridians. I'm also going to read because my habit is that I have so much I want to share with you that I'll wander off in 42 different directions. So your best chance of getting one straight story is if I go through it the way I've written it. When I was first invited to participate in this conference, I realized exactly what I wanted to share with you. William Bartram's visits to this area resonate with all of you today because of his close relations to the rich and glorious flora, that we've been able to preserve to this day. But it resonates with me differently because of his observations on the native peoples whom he met and the rare honor that I've had of getting to know their descendants who are still in Florida today. To me, William Bartram doesn't stand out in the thread of Indian-white relations that runs throughout the entire fabric of our national history. Mr. Bartram was not only a man of his own times, he remains very much a representative of all U.S. times, including the present one. And this is part of the understanding that I want to help give you today. Currently, I'm reading Robert A. Williams Jr.'s 2005 book, Like a Loaded Weapon, The Rehnquist Court, Indian Rights, and the Legal History of Racism in America. Mr. Williams' life work has been to protect the legal rights of American Indians, and in that process, he quotes noted Indian law scholar and Indian rights advocate Charles Wilkinson saying, "Indian issues veer away from other questions of race." Williams explains, Indian rights, in other words, are much different from the types of minority rights that were and remained at the center of the confusing struggle for racial equality. Ultimately, what the Indians are seeking is something much different. They're arguing for a degree of measured separateness. That is, the right to govern their reservation homelands and those who enter them by their own customs and laws and traditions, even when these might be incommensurable with the dominant society's values and ways of doing things. And that's where we join Mr. William Bartram, a story already in progress. The historical focus and the continuing current focus of the Indians are the same, although Bartram understood very little of that. That focus enfolds twin objectives. First and foremost is a determination to maintain sovereignty, exactly as Williams and Wilkinson see it, a determination that has been assaulted and eroded every single day since Europeans first arrived on the shores of North America, which is to say Florida, we all know that, right? In this regard, some of the Seminole elders still say that white people are white because they're made of the foam of the ocean that threw them upon these shores. Other Indian elders say that white people are white because they have no guilt. The other equally critical Indian objective is cultural preservation, which involves maintaining socio-cultural frontiers that protect and buttress their beliefs and actions, which in turn maintain their continuity as a people. This objective also has been under assault for as long as their sovereignty has been, and in terms of their relationships over the long term, this objective appears from our outside perspective to have been ambiguous at best and unsupportable at worst historically. But if you have the opportunity to observe its actual workings from the inside, as I have, a pattern definitely emerges. And it's a pattern that has persisted to this day, and it's a pattern that has direct application to our theme in this panel. And that is the relationships of Indians and Blacks in the era and area visited by William Bartram. And that's the topic that I want to explain to you today, because it is an absolute bedrock issue of the continued existence of American Indians. A critical element of this erosion of Indian cultural sovereignty has been and continues to be the transfer of non-Indian sociocultural processes across their cultural frontiers. This has occurred in greater and smaller ways over time, from outside political, military, and religious and economic pressures, all right? And the overwhelming lures in the 16th century, and the overwhelming lures of sneakers, pickup trucks, televisions, and cell phones in the present day, all right? Yes, they pay too much for their sneakers, just like we do. Some changes have been forced upon the Indians, some they've accepted voluntarily, wisely or unwisely. And among all of these, one of the most basic of human functions has formed the basso continuo of their interrelationships with the Indians, and that is sex. All right. Not only is it one that threatened the Indian world that Bartram visited, but it's also one that's very little understood by outsiders today in the cultural and more acutely legal detriment of the descendants of those same people. From the time of first contact through the mid-18th century, while the demographic balance in the Southeast absolutely favored the Indians, the first inhabitants, interrelationships of Indians and Europeans and Africans, and in this instance I'm speaking specifically here of sexual relationships, whether of 30 minutes or a lifetime's duration, still favored the Indians because of their demographic superiority and their possession of the land. Not ownership, you understand, but possession by right of occupation and military prowess. When power accrued to certain outside individuals, the Indians saw sex and procreation with such individuals as bringing their power into the society. That's such a simple definition that it's almost simplistic. But the process was rarely ever haphazard. Social rules and protocols governed these contacts. By the mid-18th century, however, as Spanish power in the Southeast waned and English power waxed, overall European colonization rose sharply, and the larger balance of power began to shift away from the native peoples, particularly the Muskogee peoples of the lower Southeast, erroneously referred to as Creeks today. The Indians saw this, and their attitudes began to indicate a growing anxiety based upon their determination to preserve their culture by restricting more and more these sexual relationships. By the time our observer, Mr. Bartram, traveled here, the world of the Southeastern Indians was being transformed more rapidly than it had been since the coming of the Europeans and the Africans. The rate of miscegenation, a tiresome word but useful in this instance, had increased to a greater speed than ever before. The Indians' inability to completely control this change was but one reason why sanctions were being promulgated and enforced in many instances against such relationships. Bartram mentioned in an early instance that he was transported across a river by an Indian ferryman who had a white wife. What we may infer from this event is, for one thing, that it was still unusual enough to Bartram for him to comment on it. Then we might infer also that the occupation chosen by the Indian placed him outside of a village and community, which may have been his choice, or it may have been the choice of the community. Either way, I don't want you to think that I'm being naive here. Sex is sex. I don't care what your culture or your language or society might be, and no rules, even those proscribing such contacts and imposing ostracization or even death, will ever be completely effective. Bartram, the relatively broad-minded Euro-American, nevertheless made his own view clear in a number of ways, reminding us that after all, he could not be other than a product of his times. He concluded, for instance, on the basis of conversations with various Indians that they, quote, were desirous of becoming united with us in civil and religious society. But this conclusion was neither the blanket nor the definitive statement that it may seem, for two main reasons. For one thing, independent thought had and continues to have a high social value among the Muskogee people. For another, the very individuals who would speak to a non-Indian were a self-selecting audience. It's all too clear from the documents that the Europeans and Euro-Americans in this period consistently were seeking out individuals who had the power to speak for the Indians and to enforce agreements and treaties and, above all, land cessions. All right, remember that within a short generation after Mr. Bartram's visit, a brand new United States would emerge, and Article 3 of the Constitution, its founding document, would both confirm tribes as sovereign nations and at the same time institutionalize America's determination to obtain tribal lands and assimilate or destroy the people. Throughout all of these interactions, it's been advantageous to the non-Indians never to fully recognize the internal power structures of the tribes. That is, as but one example, why the English speakers constantly apply such honorifics as king and governor, and even in a couple of instances, emperor, to Indian leaders. The more power the Europeans can ascribe to an individual, the more power they can choose to believe that he or she has to impose binding pacts upon the Indian people. Later, Mr. Bartram compliments the Indians for having an innate moral principle that leads them to virtuous actions, but he's still not broad-minded enough to refrain from calling them savages. And important for my subject, when speaking of personal, that is, sexual relationships between Indians and non-Indians, he refers to them as temporary. With the best intentions of which he's capable, Mr. Bartram is imposing his own cultural template on a very different culture. He sees relationships between Indians and non-Indians as, by their very nature, transient. And that's the point that I want to make here, because where you and I go wrong today is in trying to make sense of these interactions in the period viewed by Mr. Bartram, in again imposing our own, that is, non-Indian interpretations on the Indians' actions. We see all too often from the documents that Euro-American males did indeed view relationships with Indian women as liaisons rather than permanent arrangements. The point that we fail to understand here is that the Indians did not. They viewed their world as having a very definite cultural frontier, rather than what the Euro-Americans saw as a permeable boundary. So this is an understanding, a clarification, that I also want to show you here today concerning the Indians and those slaves who were viewed historically as having lived with and or intermarried with the Indians of Florida during Mr. Bartram's era. In today's larger non-Indian national social system, social scientists give much time to discussions of interethnic self-identification. For example, if a black and white couple produce offspring, how will those children see themselves or self-identify, as black or as white? But despite lingering social pressures, the children have more choices today than ever before. And the good news is, at least from my perspective, that those offspring often don't feel the need to see themselves as either. But in the Muskogee world, where cultural preservation was and continues to be such a high-value element, there are other considerations, and they are, as we would term them today, deal breakers. And this is what I want to help you to recognize. One well-known example of this reality is the Indian who was born about the time when Bartram visited Florida, later called by whites King Philip. The popular imaging of Philip in Bartram's day was that he was a Spanish man. But we have only to focus on Philip's life and his actions to realize that this imaging was situational rather than genetic or cultural. This man grew to adulthood on the Alachua Savannah, a former Spanish cattle rancho, where Indians had learned to speak Spanish, and many, Bartram noted, were wearing silver Catholic crosses. But despite any misrepresentations about him that we may interject today, the Indians saw him, and he saw himself, first and foremost, as an Indian. The same process occurred in the life of the short-lived war leader who would fight in Florida a few short generations after Mr. Bartram's arrival, known to English speakers today as Osceola. An entire line of his clan descendants already lived in Florida when Bartram visited, and they continue to live here today. Osceola undoubtedly carried white blood and possibly black blood as well. Regardless of his genetics, however, he saw himself completely as an Indian, and ultimately he gave his life in confirmation of that belief. So the point of all this is that there has been historically no middle ground, no equivocation in the Seminoles' process of cultural identity. You're either in or you're out. And as regards the story of those blacks who found refuge in Spanish Florida, and sometimes under the aegis of the Florida Indians, this is the reality that I want to convey to you. Whether there was any significant amount of interrelations between blacks and the Indians in the period that we're discussing today is not a viable issue. And the attitudes of the Seminoles remain quite clear today, even though sex continues to entice some across cultural frontiers in the last couple of generations without clan permission. It's well known by both Indians and non-Indians that some Seminoles were buying slaves in the Second Seminole War period and before. It's known and accepted also that the Seminoles generally permitted ex-slaves to form communities of their own, that is, separate from the Indians, but again under their protection and nominal control. It's known and accepted that in some of the encounters of the Second Seminole War of Removal, ex-slaves fought alongside the Indians, or more properly, were permitted by the Indians' war councils to fight separately. Bartram saw part of the process correctly when he wrote of cowkeepers' Indian slaves that they, quote, the slaves, both male and female, are permitted to marry among them, and here he means quite clearly among themselves. Their children are free and considered in every respect equal to themselves, but the parents continue in a state of slavery as long as they live. What he's seeing is what the Indians saw as a social and cultural frontier, a stark and permanent reality. If we keep this clearly in mind, then we go too far if we attempt to transfer any portion of this imaging to a belief that slaves generally, as a result of perceived cultural equality or their facility with language, universally exercised great influence over the Indians, or that they were regarded as equals by the Indians, or that they controlled the actions of the Indians, or particularly that they were allowed to form formal relationships with Indian women by their, the slaves' own choices. As but one evidence, we know that in the process of the wars of removal, slaves sometimes turned themselves in to the U.S. soldiers, preferring the slavery to which they inevitably returned, rather than the very brutal ways they were treated by the Indians. Slavery was not a benign process, even relatively. Bartram recognizes this immediately. He continues, quote, in observing these slaves, we behold at once in their countenance and manners the striking contrast between a state of slavery and freedom. The slave Abraham is another example of one of these steps too far. He frequently is touted as having had great influence over Micanopy, just as an interpreter, not just as an interpreter, but as an advisor. The reality is, however, that Abraham was a double agent. He was in the employ of the United States military. I found his pay records. He was being paid by the United States government, and the Indians knew it. And finally, the resistors put a price on his head. There are other examples of the distinctions that have been made and continue to be made by the Seminoles, both in Florida and in Oklahoma, between Indians and blacks. But I do not want you to conclude for a moment that I'm making this distinction in order to denigrate blacks and their long, long fights for freedom and equality and opportunities within the culture that forced them to make their lives here in the United States. My points are rather pro-Indian and not anti any other group. All federally recognized FR tribes today, and in a true political irony, only those groups that are recognized by the white man's government are considered legitimate tribes, with a very few exceptions, are sovereign nations, and they exercise their sovereignty first and foremost in the matter of tribal citizenship. In the case of the Seminole tribe of Florida, and the standard that exists and persists today, the process is multi-layered and codified in tribal law, and an individual either meets the requirements and is accepted by the tribal council as a citizen, not member, citizen, or he or she does not and is not accepted. There is no middle ground. Anyone may apply, but only the tribal council is the final arbiter of whether an individual meets the qualifications. And this is not a new mindset. Even prior to 1957, when the Florida Indians had no governmental entities in the image and likeness of U.S. governmental entities, they still had leaders and traditions and methods of enforcement of their own. And all of these processes continue to exist today. And the unfortunate result of our, that is the non-Indians, trying to meld together retroactively two distinct ethnicities and cultures that the Indians saw and continued to see as distinct is very deleterious to the Indians, culturally, socially, and particularly today, legally. In the end, it becomes but another way of forcing assimilation. In 1987, the preeminent historian of American Indians, Francis Paul Pruka, S.J., summed up the prevalent and continuing attitude of U.S. society and government toward Indians when he wrote, quote, "The best term for this persistent attitude is paternalism, a determination to do what was best for the Indians according to white norms, which translated into protection, subsistence of the destitute, punishment of the unruly, and eventually taking the Indians by the hand and leading them along the path to white civilization and Christianity. In this half a millennium-old process, our Mr. William Bartram stood at least one head above many of his culture and his generation in his flexible view of the Indians whom he met, but ultimately, as regards his view of the Indians, he was an inevitably biased assimilationist. Despite this, however, as I frequently stress, if Bartram had been right and his own brand of paternalism had not been yet more cultural arrogance, we would be speaking of Indians today completely and only in the past tense. Robert Remini, the great biographer of Andrew Jackson, wrote a sentence a few years ago that still reverberates in my mind. It was a type of sweeping statement that historians love to be able to write. He said that by the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, all of the Indians of the Southeast were either transported to the West or buried under the ground. And there I was, standing there in a room full of Indians on my second day of living with the Seminoles on the Big Cypress Indian Reservation, and that thought hit me like a sledgehammer. And I thought, who is going to tell these people that they are either transported to the West or buried under the ground? And if that's not true, what does that tell me about every single other thing I have ever read about Indians, written by non-Indians? In another day, a young white student came to my office inside the beautiful new tribal headquarters building on the Hollywood Res and asked innocently, "Are there any Indians left?" And I responded, "Look around you. If there were no Indians left, who built this building? If there were no Indians left, how could there be a Seminole tribe of Florida?" And I urge you to consider all of these facts and all of these alternate ways of looking at the Seminole people, at the Indian people generally. And I urge you to remember this every time you see or hear any of them fighting to maintain their own cultural sovereignty. Thank you.
Just talk with you about the Long Warrior today. Who was he? What was he all about? Why is he important? Where did he go? And I'm not going to read or lecture to you. Instead, we're going to look at original document material and see what it has to tell us about him. The meeting that was held with Oglethorpe in 1735, we see Pt.2 as the head war chief of the Oconees, and Bartram later explained that Cowkeeper and Long Warrior were from Oconee. And you see a lot of references to Cowkeeper's name being Ahaya, Ahaye, and I believe that that is a clipping of the full name, Pt.2, and we're seeing here basically Ahaye, Ahaya, or the Cowkeeper as he becomes to be known. So this is the meeting with Oglethorpe in Savannah, and this is an account of it right here. And according to Gachet, the name Pt.2 means to push down, to throw down. And Cowkeeper, we see the meaning of Pt.2 is basically dominating, pushing down. This is the individual who bragged about killing 84 Spaniards as he was dying. And the earlier meeting in Savannah with Oglethorpe talked about Wikachumka being the Kuwu, which I think was really Shluko, or Long King. And I think he was a placeholder. I don't think he was any kind of a hereditary ruler there in Oconee, because later he's described as one of the chief men of the Palachicola. And the Palachicola were always living very close to the Oconee. Too far. And as I was mentioning, Wikachumka is one of the chief men of the Palachicola. And Bartram, evidently in talking to Cowkeeper and Long Warrior, had learned that they were from Oconee. And when the town was relocated in 1716 back over to the Chattahoochee River area, Oconee and Palachicola were just about 6 miles apart. And from Oconee, the Seminole under Cowkeeper began to move and spread out. And this account here talks about them moving to the East Coast in a southward or a southeastward direction and going to the plains of Alachua, and this new town of Cuscowilla was established. And when Oglethorpe attacked the Spanish in Florida, the Cowkeeper came to his aid with 45 Indians, and others were about ready to arrive. And he's described as an island chief. And some people have interpreted that as he was living on one of the barrier islands along the Georgia coast. Could have been somewhere along the Florida coast, could have been one of the islands in one of the estuaries, but it's shown here as island chief. So this is when he comes to Oglethorpe's aid when he's attacking St. Augustine. And here we see an occasion in 1749 where there is a disagreement between the Western Creek and the Seminole and others. And Long Warrior goes to Savannah, and some of the other Creek are there with him. And there's this disagreement with the Malachi. And I've seen some suggestions that people from South Carolina and Georgia probably tried to entice him to split off and become a chief himself. But I haven't been able to find the original documents, so I haven't really included that or gone very far with it. And then in 1757, Cowkeeper goes up to Savannah for a meeting with Oglethorpe. And he says he's been to the southward, and he's come from the southward, and he's prevented the Spanish from cultivating their lands or extending the settlements from Pensacola or St. Augustine. So he's already in that area, and he's fighting the Spanish, killing Spaniards. And we see this mention, okay, and this is the another page of that same document here. And it says that he's hitherto made war to the southward, and he's now a stranger to the state affairs in the Indian nation, having been so long absent. So we see sometime before 1754, he's been down in Florida, he's been fighting the Spanish and doing things there. Schluko, or long warrior, sometimes pronounced Schluko, is actually a title. It's the title, it's something like general. It's the person who decides when it's the appropriate time to march off to go to war, rallies everybody. So long warrior, Schluko, is not this individual's name. This individual's name is actually Wiofki. And Catherine helped me sort through all of these different names to get all that figured out. But he signs the Piccolata document as the head that's there representing Lachua, and it's Wiofki. And his signature is a mark that looks like an eternity signal turned to the side. But he went off with Colonel Alexander Montgomery and the Hyler regiments to defend them against the Cherokee, and was up in the Carolinas fighting the Cherokee with them. And evidently, if he hadn't been there, Colonel Alexander Montgomery, along with Captain James Grant, where does that word fit in? First governor of British Florida, saved all these British military personnel, and he was just widely known for doing all of these things. So on the left is Archibald Montgomery. On the right is James Grant, who was a captain, later first British governor of Florida. And so he's got this kind of a reputation, and people in South Carolina, people in Georgia, even Indians further north, all know about him. And with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Major Francis Ogilvie prepared a census of the southeastern Indians. And this is a copy of the full page. And it's interesting that over to the right, toward the top, there is an Oconee settlement, and they've got 50 or so warriors. But further down the page, there is Lachue and New Oconee, and the head of New Oconee is Wiofki, which we've already heard about. This is some detail of a part of that same document. And down toward the bottom, you can see there's the town of the Palachacola with 60 warriors, and then there are the Oconees with 50 warriors. Those are the Oconee that stayed to the west, over along the Chattahoochee and over in West Florida. And they're very different from New Oconee. And we see another part of the document further down the page where we have Lachue and New Oconee with 130 warriors total between the two. And you have to really be careful when you're reading the original documents. You have to determine, well, am I looking at Oconee from the Chattahoochee, or am I looking at the New Oconee king from over in East Florida? More detail on the elaboration. Lachue, or Lachua, and Ahia, the cowkeeper, is there. And also, different spelling of Wiofki. Instead with the W, it's O-Y, Oiofki, the long warrior Oconee king. And here is some detail of the Piccolata Conference. And down toward the bottom of the large portion there, you see Wiofki. And then the small section down there, you see Lachue, Wiofki, with the infinity symbol on the side. So, long warrior that you're looking at is his full name, his actual name is Wiofki. He's got the title Long Warrior. Here's a March 30th, 1776 document talking about the Seminole Indians have to join to keep all of the rebels out of the province. And he knows that Cowkeeper and the Seminole stand in awe of the West Florida Creek. So they understand that there could be repercussions for really taking sides in the American Revolution. But still, they're willing to do that, and Cowkeeper winds up being given a crown and special awards. And here is May 2nd, 1976. And we see King of the Oconee mentioned because of his repeated success as a great warrior in his expeditions against the Choctaw. And this has to be Weohsky, Long Warrior from right here that they're talking about. It can't be the Oconee King over the Chattahoochee. They were not doing anything to take sides. So we see that the King of the Oconee has to be Long Warrior Weohsky. Here is some more detail on Shluko, or Long Warrior, another description of his fame for going over to West Florida and fighting the Choctaws. So this is undoubtedly our Long Warrior that Bartram interacted with right here, that we're dealing with. Here's a May 8, 1776 letter here. And Thomas Brown said of the King of the Oconees, Long Warrior, his conduct at the Congress does him the greatest honor. They're talking about a conference that was planned for Piccolata in 1775-76, and then they had to move the conference to the cow ford, and there are a lot of cow fords here at Pilatka. So this again is King of the Oconee, which has to be Weohsky, has to be Long Warrior. And another letter here, the later British governor, Pt.2, in December 1775, actually commissioned Long Warrior and the Pumpkin King, Wisichimiko, as captains here at Pilatka, or Cowford. By the way, Pilatka is the original name of this place right here. And according to Gachet, it means things fall down, or I fall down. Now, you look out the back here, and the terrain dramatically drops and falls off as you come from Gainesville over to the St. John's. I've got a close colleague who said, now, Steve, you can't say that. Because they also liked to take the Ocklawaha River route, and they loved to stop at Spalding's store, frolic a bit. So by the time they got here, they were ready to fall down. So I can't decide, which is really better, but either of the two. And it says, the Indians came also. I thought it, my lord, for their good, the good of His Majesty's service, to have commissions made out for the Pumpkin King and the Long Warrior as captains of their towns and of East Florida, which was given to them in military form at the head of a captain's guard with 2 6-pounders on the, I can't read it here, and then they fired 15 rounds from those cannons, and then 3 volleys from the riflemen also. So this is kind of like 4th of July going on, something like people around here had never seen. Cannons being fired, shots thundering through the woods, guns being fired, gunpowder billowing and building up. It was a big thing. Now, why would they do this? They wanted the British wanted the help of the Seminole here to really defend the frontier. Now, Long Warrior Weohsky, King of the Oconees, he's an officer and a gentleman. He is a formally commissioned British officer. Now, other people talked about him being one of the wild people, Istisamoli, and just being a renegade. And then later, the American rebels wanted to come down here and kind of teach him a lesson and take his cattle back. And he's this renegade, this Istisamoli, this wild person. But he's actually a commissioned British officer carrying out the orders of war. And the governor formally commissioned him to go up to Georgia and specifically gather cattle to feed the people in St. Augustine and feed the troops. So December 1775, this is what people in this area would have seen. They would have seen the British ship, the St. Lawrence, anchored right out here off of Beef O'Brady's with 15 cannon rounds being fired off, and then 3 volleys from all the riflemen on the front. So it was a big deal. And I've got a copy of the letter where he wrote to the King of England. He said, "I hope you agree, I have commissioned them." And the king writes back, "You did the right thing." So he was not just some wild person running around. He was an officer and a gentleman. Here we're seeing them being called for and sent out to defend this area of North Florida and the area between the St. Mary's and the Altamaha. And again, they're sending for Cowkeeper and the Oconee King. And this is before Cowkeeper's death, so this is definitely the Oconee King. You have to differentiate between the one that was remaining over on the Chattahoochee. And then the West Florida Creek sent out a bulletin. They said, listen, don't take sides with the British, remain neutral. But they went off and they defended the area for the British anyways, and Cowkeeper was awarded a silver crown, and they did well. And after Cowkeeper's death, there was a period of time when people weren't sure, who was in command, who was actually leading. And Alexander McGillivray, who is the mulatto Spanish Indian ruling at the time, says that he has little acquaintance with the present leaders, and the former ones he all knew are dead. And of course, we've got the famous letter with a reaction to Cowkeeper's death. But we can't find any kind of a letter or statement about this formally commissioned British officer who is Long Warrior Weofke. And here in 1789, we have this letter from the Oconee King, who is Weofke Long Warrior, being sent. And going back here, this is 1784, this is a letter from Carlos Howard on the reaction to the death of Cowkeeper. And it talks about hijos of Cowkeeper, or the sons of Cowkeeper, in this letter. And there's a part of it that talks about the oldest son, and he's probably actually intending to say the oldest nephew in that letter. And here is a May 29th, 1794 letter with the West Florida Creek trying to restrain the Oconee King right here. And this is written to the Spanish leader Quesada at the time. They didn't want them to do anything. It's not showing the whole slide. Can we reduce that or anything? In this preceding letter, we see Governor Quesada, the Spanish governor, talking about the Oconee King, the chief Indian from Alachua. And after this time, we see this new person as the leader. We see this person, King Thomas Paine. So there's this nebulous time where we see Long Warrior no longer being mentioned much, and all of a sudden we see King Thomas Paine. Now, to me, that tripped all kinds of things, and I started to think, what is going on? So the mulatto king, Alexander McGillivray, didn't know who was really in charge. He knew Cowkeeper had died. I don't think he knew much about Weofke and what was going on there. So who in the world was Thomas Paine? Well, he was a young United States Navy officer who arrived on the USS Tartar in 1821 to escort the last of the Spanish out after New Florida became American possession. But this is well after Thomas Paine's death over near Noonan's Lake in that area. So couldn't have anything to do with him. But there was a Thomas Paine who was the son of a British family. He was raised as a Quaker. He was one of the founders of the American Philosophical Society, along with John Bartram, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and many of the leaders that wrote the Declaration of Independence. There was a Thomas Paine letter found in the belongings of William Bartram upon his death, and Thomas Paine wrote about Native American people in a very Rousseauan kind of manner, much like Bartram did. So Weofke, the Long Warrior, or Oconee King, increasingly became known as King Thomas Paine after 1787. By 1790, he no longer used the names Weofkee, Long Warrior, or Oconee King. And after that date, he only used the name King Thomas Paine. People started thinking about Weofkee, Long Warrior, King of the Oconees, and he kind of fades out. And then it's all about Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was somebody that William Bartram knew well, undoubtedly admired, and William Bartram and Weofkee, the Long Warrior or Oconee King, probably discussed philosophy a little bit during their visits and interactions. And the Long Warrior, King of the Seminole, was the only leader that William Bartram chose to paint. And after that meeting, numerous individuals in 8 different states, he only painted Weofkee. He traveled through North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and just painted this one leader. The orthography, the spelling representation of his name varies. Sometimes it's P-A-I-N-E, P-A-I-N, P-A-Y-N-E, P-A-I-N. The Spanish spelled it as P-E-N. So you'll see it spelled various ways. And here we see the earliest use of the name Paine. We see it in a 1788 letter to Spanish Governor Cespedes, and it's in this document right here. And he's talking about Paine, Jefe, or king of the Indio Seminoles. And here we see it again in another letter in 1792. Down at the bottom, he's desiring Thomas Paine as a smiling brother. And here's a letter from John Forrester to Governor Quesada regarding Thomas Paine, P-A-I-N. And this is a document that describes the discovery of a Paine letter in Bartram's papers. So I get this vision of myself, walking around those areas thinking, I think they probably discussed philosophy and all these very esoteric kinds of concepts. And I think Long Warrior Weofkee, King Thomas Paine, was a very astute, bright individual. And he really was capable of a lot more than people ever realized. So I think this was going on and explains a lot of things. We've got Paine's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. I think that's really Long Warrior's Landing. Oop, it's jumping so much. Yeah, this is a list of Seminole towns according to Hawkins. And over on the Ocklawaha River, there's Ocklawaha Fluco. Well, that could be, it's kind of like the big river, but it's not really a big river. I think this is Sluco's village on the Ocklawaha, or Sluco's, or Long Warriors, later to become known simply as Paine's Landing. Age-wise, would this even work out? William Bartram estimated Long Warrior's age to be about 60 in 1774, so that would put his date of birth about 1714. According to other individuals, whenever King Thomas Paine died, that would have been September when he was wounded, 1812. So sometime 1812, 1813. So if Simons is correct, if Bartram was correct, he would have died and been about 98 years old. So that matches up pretty good. And in other accounts, we read that King Thomas Paine was being called Old Woman by the young warriors. He didn't just impetuously run off and jump into battle. He really thought and planned things. And here is another account where it says that he lived to be almost 100 years old, and talking about him being described as an old woman again. And this is from William Simon's book here. And here he's said to have lived to about 100 years of age. So these accounts match up quite well. So what I've done is reduce this to a very logical kind of argument and get it away from what I believe or what I suspect or what I would like to make out of it, and express it like the cumulative law of algebra. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So if A is Wealthy, B is Long Warrior, C is Schluko, D is Schluko, and E, New Oconee King, all of those are equivalent and equal. And finally, if Thomas King was the king from Cowkeeper's death in 1783 till 1812, then all of those are equal and the same. And I think Long Warrior was very astute. He realized the pressures coming from West Florida, the pressure of transitioning between British rule and Spanish rule, and then the Americans trying to move in. He very astutely balanced all of this quite adeptly. And for a long time, he had been kind of like the Ben Bernanke for the Seminole here. He had managed this cattle industry. And there were records of them selling like 1,000 head of cattle at a time. At today's prices, a good cow or heifer or whatever being sold for being butchered would go for about $1,600. That's $1.6 million you're talking about. And some years they sold much more than that. Well, the Andalusian cattle are smaller, lighter weight, so maybe it was only $1,200 a cow, but you're still talking $1 million industry or more. So he was really good for managing the economy and all of these things. So I'll cut it right there. Copies of all these original letters and documents are on the CDs on the table. There are 889 documents in PDF form. So I'd like to have you guys check them out, and you can use them for your own research. So thank you.
Thank you. I was curious, what inspired you to look up information about the Long Warrior? Like, what inspired you about him?
What inspired me to talk about Long Warrior? When I was at University of Florida, my linguistics instructor was when I was at University of Florida, my linguistics professor was Martha Hardman Di Battista, and she was known for being quite hard to do well with. And I did my paper on Seminole linguistics, and I wound up making a B on the paper, and everybody's like, "How did you do that?" So I had this interest in Seminole for a long time, and I've got a lot of Native American friends, and whenever I retired from teaching in South Georgia, I had to come back to Florida and move back to heaven. So I chose Palatka. And I didn't know much about Palatka at the time, but Wealthy Long Warrior is a man who lived in my hometown, what I call my hometown now. So Kathy Deegan was going to do this presentation and do this segment. And she was very busy, and I got busy working with the Bartram committee to plan everything here. And I said, well, I'm doing some research on this, and I could fill in for Kathy. So I just decided to run with it.
Where was Osceola born? All right. There are some people in Georgia who will claim Osceola. As a matter of fact, I have a file, I swear to you, this thick, on people who are sure they're related to Osceola. I keep threatening to rent a park somewhere near Atlanta and invite them all to show up and talk to each other. Osceola was born in Alabama, all right, in what we call Alabama now. We're near Big Talashe, which was a town, an Indian town well known in that area. There was a white man named Thomas Simpson Woodward, one of my favorite all-time characters in history, who lived for many, many years among the Indians, had an Indian life partner, led a company of Indian friendlies, they were called, under Andrew Jackson. And he wrote letters, wrote history, and was a very, very fine avocational historian. And he knew all of Osceola's family. He wrote about where he was born, wrote about his uncles and their travels. I always loved it that he signed every letter he wrote with the phrase, "May you live as long as suits your convenience." I always thought that was great. So yes, Osceola was born in what we would now call North Central Alabama, period. Don't let those Georgia folks fool you.
When I began traveling the southeast colonies and the Willaca or St. John's River with my father John in 1765, I fell in love with this place. And after my trip, beginning in 1773, I decided to write my book, The Travels. I considered it to be somewhat of a guide to a landscape few had ever seen. I hope the book describing the places, plants, animals, and peoples energizes the reader with the desire to experience the same scenes. My thoughts about the land were with the concern about what is here. I prayed at Mount Royal once, O sovereign Lord, since it has pleased thee to endue man with power and preeminence here on earth and establish his dominion over all creatures, may we look up to thee, that our understanding may be so illuminated with wisdom and our hearts warmed and animated with a due sense of charity, that we may be enabled to do thy will and perform our duties towards those submitted to our service and protection, and be merciful to them even as we hope for mercy. The lands will have changed in many ways, but I hope the river I wrote of is still there.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce a panel that will talk about the Bartram Trail. This morning, this afternoon, we've had 3 panels talk about Bartram and his work, both John and William, and there have been frequent references to something called the Bartram Trail. So what is the Bartram Trail? When we talk about that trail, what is it? We know that both John and William Bartram traveled thousands of miles in what we now call the Southeast, from the Carolinas westward to present-day Louisiana, from the mountains of western North Carolina down to central Florida. They traveled on established routes. They traveled by boat. They traveled by horseback. They traveled on the trading paths that Catherine referred to earlier this afternoon. So is the trail a retracing of these routes? And if it is, how does that work? What does that mean? And I'm not going to answer that question. I'm going to leave to our panel of trail managers and experts to talk about that in the next 45 minutes or so. And let me introduce the panel in the order that they'll present. We first have Brad Sanders, who's the author of A Guide to William Bartram's Travels, published in 2002. He's now working on a revision of that guide. He's a long-standing member of the Bartram Trail Conference and is also the editor of the website. Walter Wingfield is an attorney from Atlanta who retired to North Carolina. And in fact, the land that he retired to is adjacent to the Bartram Trail in North Carolina. And so he joined the North Carolina Bartram Trail Society in 2005, served on their board since 2006, and now is the current president. Many of you in the room know Dean Campbell, who was born and raised here in Palatka. Even though he lives in neighboring St. Johns County, he still regards Palatka as his home. And he's been a leader in a sustained effort with Sam Carr and many of you here in this room to build a Bartram Trail waterway here in Putnam County. He's a member of the Bartram Trail Putnam County Committee. He serves on the board of the St. Johns River Alliance. And then finally, we have Dorinda here, who I won't go through her resume, but she's the author of numerous works on the environment, environmental ethics, and southern nature writing. And she's also the president of our Bartram Trail Conference. So what is the Bartram Trail?
This is a virtual map because it exists only on the computer and in our minds of the Bartram Trail Conference. I created this map for the Bartram Trail Conference website with an account with Google Maps. You can go in and zoom in just like you can any Google map, zoom out. As you zoom in, you get more detail. I had the idea that people, well, first of all, when I wrote my book, I wanted to do it so that people who wanted to follow the Bartram Trail could get out and follow the Bartram Trail. People followed the Bartram Trail as a hiking trail. They wanted to know where it was because they wanted to get on one end and hike to another end. And it was difficult to explain to them you can't do that. That the Bartram Trail on ground is essentially a virtual trail also. And the convenient thing about my map here is it shows what our concept is of the string of pearls.
where William Bartram traveled is the string, and all these little sites and places that we want to talk about and visit are the pearls. Unfortunately, Google Maps makes them look like upside-down pearls. So that's the string of pearls, and that's the William Bartram Trail. Because it is a Google map, everybody can see it. It's free. You can look at it at home on your computer. You can look at it on your iPhone. You can zoom in. You can zoom out. You can click on these items, and you might see a photograph, or you might see a quote from William Bartram, or you just might see a description of the site. And the site would be related to the history of when William Bartram was there, or maybe it's a site he had visited, or it's related to something botanical where you can go visit and get the Bartram experience. You can use this map to travel. Originally, when I was doing maps for my book, I was obsessed with determining where William Bartram actually traveled and how you can go and follow which roads to turn down and where to go. And now I've given up that. I'm still obsessed with where did William Bartram exactly travel. And as you zoom in, you'll notice that some of these lines go where no man can go or no woman can go. And so this is where we think Bartram actually traveled from best research. And it's up to you to determine how you're going to follow it. And if you zoom in far enough, you can do that. The other nice thing is that this map can be updated at any time, live. I can take things out, I can put things in, and I can collaborate with anybody else who wants to help build this map. Next map. For the 250th anniversary of John William Bartram's travels to Georgia and Florida, I created yet another map, just showing 1765 and 1766. And you get to both of these maps with the Bartram Trail Conference website. Now, when the Bartram Trail Conference was first organized, they were charged with determining whether the Bartram Trail could be a national scenic trail. And it was determined that it couldn't be. So the work was left up to the Bartram Trail Conference because of that. But I've been thinking about what if it could be a national historic trail? What if it was a national trail? Then it would be organized, the federal government would be in that, there'd be some money. Still, state and local organizations would be involved. Now the Lewis and Clark. So, next to the William Bartram Trail, my favorite trail is the Lewis and Clark Trail. And you'll notice that this is a national park system has done the maps. They've got an online map that's interactive, lots of publications. There are National Park Service visitor centers. There are state visitor centers, local visitor centers, historic sites, and everything is accessible through the Park Service maps. Now, I think there are a lot of relationships between the Bartram Trail and something like the Lewis and Clark Trail, and that you can't travel where Lewis and Clark traveled because they were in a boat on a river. So you follow along on each side of the river in a car on roads. So it's not a trail in the sense that people want it to be. They want to get out and hike on it. But a lot of the national trails seem to be based on some kind of military activity or westward expansion. The Lewis and Clark Trail is exploration. They discovered new plants and new animals, just like somebody we know did in Florida. So there are a lot of similarities. The Lewis and Clark Trail is 3,700 miles with 100 sites. And I wondered about the fact that if someday we could revisit the issue of the Bartram Trail becoming a National Historic Trail. Now the last picture. And one of the advantages, of course, is this large collection of organizations documenting the trail. As you're following along, You may go through little towns. If you need to make a turn, this is what you see. Lewis and Clark pointing in the direction that you're supposed to turn to get to the next site, the next pearl on the string. So, well, thank you very much. Let me share that. Everybody go to the website and look at our map.
As you know, the Bartrams arrived in Florida in 1765. It was the older John, the father, and his son, who doesn't look much like his son in this image, but we can fix that with a little bit of Photoshop. So, a young man in his mid-20s when he arrived with Dad. And just like William didn't look much like that previous photograph when he arrived in Florida, Florida didn't look very much like it does today when they arrived. There were no highways in Florida, and there were very few roads in Florida, and although they arrived by horseback and made it to St. Augustine and over to Fort Piccolata by horse, they very quickly did just what all tourists do. They took to the I-95 of 1765, which was the St. Johns River. And so they proceeded up the St. Johns River south, and they went down about 200 miles, down as far as Puzzle Lake in the St. Johns. Then they returned up to the mouth and then got off the river about the point where they got on up near Jacksonville. But the important part about that was that they spent 11 fun-filled days in Putnam County, the red. The way that they navigated their trail through Florida, the way they explored Florida, when they came down the first time was by the bateau, a vessel that looks very much like this. We think, although we don't really know because the words from Bartram are very confusing, that his craft looked very much like this, but we're not really certain, or at least we weren't very certain until very recently when we came up with a Bartram image from the Natural History Museum of the UK, and it turns out that William Bartram actually traveled in kayaks that look very much like Sam Carr's. Yes, clean shaven. But he really enjoyed the first trip down, and so he came back and did exactly the same thing that Dad did. He traveled it by water. Didn't go quite as far, but because he knew about Putnam County, he spent a lot longer there when he came on his return trip. But the point is that he made the trip. His trail was the St. Johns River, and it was our traveling in the wake of William and John Bartram on the St. Johns River that was the inspiration for our vision for the Putnam County Bartram Trail. The way that the trail came to being, you kind of heard last night from Nancy Harris, the commissioner. The vision of a Bartram Trail Putnam County was presented to her as the county commission, and she immediately endorsed it, appointed Sam Carr, the commissioner, the chair of the committee. Committee was formed, conducted research, developed a plan, developed resources for visitors, got local government support, secured funding, and most of all got volunteer action, me, involved in the project. The research was done by really looking at all the Bartram documents to identify where the sites were that the Bartrams actually visited within Putnam County, where they set foot, where they hiked, where they camped, where they gathered plants and that kind of thing. Then doing the ground truthing to actually nail those sites down and organizing them into some kind of a path or a trail. The fun part of that, of course, was the ground truthing, going out with the Bartram documents on site, paddle along the river and read those documents and say, yeah, I think it was right about here. Going on shore, walk around a little bit. Does it match up, the lay of the land? Does that match up to what they wrote? If it didn't, nope, move on. If it did, like Satsuma Spring here, where the everything about the setting lined up with exactly the words within John's journal or William's travels, then we could kind of nail that down with evidence that was collected on site. And only recently was that kind of confirmed when we found, again, another lithograph of the Bartrams actually at Satsuma Spring. Unfortunately, we had already had most of our images printed, so we didn't get to have this one printed to display with other William Bartram drawings. But once we collected and assessed all the sites within Putnam County, we came up with
sites that we could very closely document where they were. As far as the actual visitor resources, which was to get people out to those sites, we developed kiosks, printed brochures, maps, site signage, and most importantly, a website. We also benefited from a brand new river center that gave us a presence there. Our initial documents that we came up with were maps that were generated for us, GIS maps through the Putnam County IT department. And although they look pretty good, Sam Carr's abilities with a red magic marker left a lot to be desired. So we went after money. And so we received a grant from the Florida Humanities Council, $15,000 that was matched by Putnam County with in-kind services, primarily through their IT department. With those $15,000, we hired Sailforth Productions. Sailforth Productions developed our very cool logos. Thank you very much. And they developed our very professional brochures and maps, which you've probably seen. The kiosks, if you haven't seen those, they're located at 3 or 4 different sites along our Bartram Trail. Take some time to look at those. They are just really professional and nice. Our River Center you'll see tonight. There's a little Bartram exhibit there. Our volunteers went out armed with the kiosks, went out, placed those in the ground. County Commission and local officials came out and helped to place those kiosks, and we actually had unveilings, very supportive. It's really important to have the elected officials behind us and supporting the effort. They turned out beautifully on site. These things are just really nice. The next step, of course, was going out on the river and putting up the site signage, actually putting these things in place. That was sometimes a challenge, but the signs are highly visible on the river. You can see them from over a mile away. They rely really heavily on technology and the website. As you can see, there's a code on the sign. You can hit that with your smart device. That'll take you right to the website, which then has all of the resources on the website: maps, commentary, the Bartram drawings, interactive maps, maps of the biking trails, the hiking trails, the car trails, and most importantly, the paddling trails. You can also download those maps and take them with you in hard copy. We also have a YouTube channel, which is also very cool. We're very fortunate in Putnam County that a lot of these sites are still very much in their natural state, very much as William Bartram probably saw them. Some of them are more developed. Am I getting like a dead battery thing? Oh, I'm sorry, that's my iPad. It's telling me my time is up. I've never used it before. It worked. Okay, very good. I'll press on for another minute here then. Even where our sites are not in natural areas, some of them still can evoke that Bartram appearance, so they're very cool. Really importantly, the people who reside along the St. Johns River have been very supportive in allowing us to place our markers on their private property. In some cases, we have public property that's on the site, and we can affix our signs to that. Helps with maintenance and protection of our sites. Since we've since our site went live and our trail went live, we've had a lot of visitors who have come through, paddling groups, educational groups, thanks to Tom Hallett. It covers the entire county. We've got, like I said, 30 pearls, but you can see that those pearls extend far beyond Putnam County. And our overall vision really would be to expand this trail to include the entire St. Johns River, the extent that the Bartrams traveled. The cool part about it is that the trail is there. There is no maintenance fee. Access is universal, no admission cost, and oh yes, there is free parking. Find that anywhere else in Florida. The trail is environmentally friendly, very low impact, proven economic benefits. If you build it, they'll come. You guys are proof of that. Development costs are minimal because most improvements are actually discouraged. Putnam County has developed a template, made the initial investment with the logos and that kind of thing. Those could be easily applied to any other county. Change the name Putnam County to St. John's, whatever. Use our signage. It's there. It's free. You can have it. 7 key counties could pick this up, and
it would really make a really nice river-wide trail. So that's my story.
This morning, we heard a lot about alligators, painted vultures, and pawpaws. You won't find any of those things on the North Carolina Bartram. We're moving to the mountains. The North Carolina Bartram Trail is a 70-plus mile hiking trail. I mean, this is serious. It's a backpacking trail. It's for serious hikers as well as day hikers. And it roughly parallels the route that was taken by William Bartram in May of 1775 when he came to western North Carolina. It actually connects to another Bartram Trail, which is the Georgia Bartram Trail. And I'll get to a little more to that in a minute. That's another 37 miles. So you have a total of over 100 miles of hiking, and it connects to other trails in the area, including the Appalachian Trail in 2 places. Our trail is managed by the North Carolina Bartram Trail Society, which is an incorporated 501c3 organization, and it's a membership organization. We subsist on dues, contributions from individuals, grants, and proceeds from our sale of our mounts. That's it. As I mentioned, we connect to the AT, the Appalachian Trail, in 2 places. At Waya Bald, which, if any of you are familiar with that area, that's the highest point on our trail. It's over 5,300 feet. And there's some thought by some people that Bartram may have gone there. There's a question about that, as to which peak he was on when he talked about resting on the most elevated peak and seeing a sublimely awful scene of power and magnificence, a world of mountains piled upon mountains. But you can get that feeling from getting on Waya Bald. The idea of building a trail to commemorate Bartram's trip to western North Carolina began with a man named Walter McKelvey, who was a retired landscape architect. And he went to a meeting of the Georgia Conservancy in the early 1970s, and he found out about the Georgia Bartram Trail Society. They were already in the process of building a trail. And he talked this idea up. He wanted to have a trail that commemorated Bartram's visit to western North Carolina, and also wanted to promote among people William Bartram and his trip. And gradually a group was formed to carry out his idea. And the timing of this, of course, coincided with the 200th anniversary of Bartram's actual trip to western North Carolina in May 1775, and also with the bicentennial. And so initially the group worked with the Georgia Bartram Trail group in trying to start planning and building this trail. But that became difficult because of the distances involved, so they decided to form their own organization, and they did that in 1977. And they also saw that when they were planning it, that following Bartram's actual route was almost impossible for a couple of reasons. One, they don't know exactly where he went. There's still a lot of argument about where he went, how he got from point A to point B. The other thing is that they did know that he came right up the valley of the Little Tennessee River, which is where the Indian trails would have been and where all the Indian villages, Cherokee villages, were. And that's US 441. It's a 4-lane highway, and so you don't want to hike there. So what they decided to do is to create a trail that would go through the Nantahala National Forest in the mountains along a route that roughly paralleled his trail, his route. And you can still see the same plants, the flora and the fauna that he writes about and describes. And he identified a number of species that hadn't previously been identified. Our early work in building the trail was done in a much different environment from today, because we started in the 1970s. And at that time, the Forest Service had the capacity to help us. and they really supervised the construction of the trail. Most of the work was done by the Youth Conservation Corps, the Young Adult Conservation Corps, Boy Scout groups, outward bound groups, digging the tread and so forth. This was tough work. And today, however, we're about to open a new section of the trail that's about 3.7 miles long. And the Forest Service doesn't have the capacity or the personnel or the funding to help us at all. And the newest section we're constructing through professional trail builders, and we got a grant from the Recreational Trails Program to do this. It's a matching grant, and we have to pay part of the cost out of our own funds. But we were fortunate enough to be able to do this through a piece of property that we acquired title to through adverse possession, and that's another story. I'm not going to get into details. You can ask me about it if you're interested. But we ended up selling that property to the Forest Service. It took us 15 years almost to do all this, but we finally are about to have it done. And that's all I'll say for that.
I just wanted to say that Chuck didn't give himself very much introduction. Chuck was a former chair of the Bartram Trail Conference president and one of the authors of the Outdoor Guide to Bartram's Travels. So he knows whereof all of these gentlemen are speaking. We've had a lot of caution and encouragement to go back to original manuscripts today, and so what I want to do is go back in time and then go forward. Where do we go from here? And to pay respects to someone who was among those founders for the Bartram Trail Conference, and that's Jane Yarn. She was the vice chairman of the eastern section for the original Bartram Trail Conference Board of Managers, an outstanding outdoors woman, but also an absolutely ramrod straight member of the Garden Clubs of Georgia, who used a lot of the Garden Club's political influence to do so many good things in this state that I call home. So the Bartram Trail Conference comes from very strong roots. And so we do go back to that original report from 1979, the Bartram Heritage Report. This is in the first edition. It had 1,000 copies of it, and I have one of them, so Nancy knows all about that. And this was the original vision, that there would be, as it was described, a string of pearls. Here the red dots represent places that were known as primary heritage sites, where we know William Bartram stood, so that you could go and stand there and be in his place. The green dots on the map represent what they call secondary sites. These are places that we don't know if he was there, but they certainly continue to look in 1979 as we would envision they looked when William Bartram passed through this area. And then the broader hashed area was a 50-mile wide corridor in which the members of this organization focused their attention on how to draw the trail. And so again, this is Brad's map that is not only Brad's map, but our map, your map. Go on the Bartram Trail Conference website and download it and follow it at your own. You'll notice that there is a non-standard, very large gold and red star out on the end of the trail where Bartram turned around. That's to recognize the fantastic work that's been done by the people in the turnaround spot in Baton Rouge from a whole variety of supporters out there who have put up 5 markers in the last month or so. And I'm pleased to announce that the board approved that this group would be hosting the Bartram Trail Conference in March, not in October, but in March of 2017 in Baton Rouge. So we look forward to joining them out there. So they get not just a gold star, but a red star. And so here they are to show you it's an amazing group of people of all different types of interests, historical societies, the Arboretum, LSU, historical homes, just the whole gamut, and along with what we've seen so evident here in Palatka, the support of county commissioners, of mayors, of development areas, regional development commissions. I put this picture up here to show one of the ancillary benefits of having a marker. This is the marker that was unveiled a couple of years ago at the Wormslow State Historic Site in Georgia. You saw some of Dennis Bird's paintings from Wormslow this morning. And the reason I put it here is prior to this marker being there, if they were going to have a guided tour led by one of these gentlemen dressed as a British Marine, they would tell people before, go out and stand by the Coca-Cola machine and your guide will be there soon. Now they tell them, go out and stand by the Bartram Trail marker and you'll be met there by... If we go back to the text of the 79 report, we have a whole list of things that these people had in mind that we would do in the future. One of these was in the field of academic support, and we've had the Fothergill Award to help support research by graduate students. Each year we send out notices across the Southeast and to Bartram scholars to let us know and to inform their graduate students that these funds are available to help support this work. Also done in the name of John Fothergill, William Bartram's great benefactor and patron. We also have in the list about trails. You've heard about trails here, elsewhere, the opportunity for Bartram sites located at botanical gardens, at heritage centers like we will be at this evening down at the River Center, other kinds of heritage centers, whether they're environmentally focused, cultural centers, museums, folklore and folk craft centers. But then what else do we still have to do, and where else can we go with this? There's the idea that was identified in 1979 of a heritage city designation. There's some places that were already identified in the report, such as Charleston, Savannah, St. Augustine, Augusta, Georgia, Pensacola, Mobile, Bay St. Louis, and Baton Rouge. These areas that were such touchstones for William Bartram as he made his way through the Southeast all the way to the Mississippi and back. The heritage collections for people who knew about collections that pertain specifically to John and William Bartram to that point in the Southeast, to go back to your home libraries, at your universities, herbarium collections that might be pertaining to what the Bartrams found, historical society collections, and to do that not only in the United States but also in Great Britain because of the deep and abiding support that came for the Bartrams from England. And then this, which really appeals to me, one of the things that was identified in the report had to do with the issuance of a coin banknote or a stamp, and the idea of having a William Bartram stamp in honor of the 250th anniversary of the beginning of his travels coming up in 2023, and having the word forever on that stamp would be a great move forward. This is the wonderful wax portrait that Donna Weaver made for us that now is on all of the new markers that we have been putting up. So let's figure out how we can get the southeastern states to all band together and get us a postage stamp to honor William. And then the other thing that has really come to the fore recently is the notion of an East Coast Greenway. This is an idea to connect existing greenways, paths, bike paths, hiking paths, canoe trails all the way from Calais, Maine down to Key West, Florida, 2,900 miles. Plenty of those segments intersect with what we have already along the East Coast that connect to Bartram. And then the idea of being able to connect those canoe trails where you could go out and be on some of the same rivers that John and William Bartram experienced in the Southeast would be another way in which we can start to tie in these historical, cultural, the natural history aspects into these recreational trails that people are loving so much and demanding so much. So I hope that those will be food for thought for you, things that you can go back and do and help us accomplish. And you know that you have so many people who have so many experiences about how you make these trails, and we will make sure that you will always be able to get a hold of Dean, Walter, Sam, and all of these other people who have already blazed those trails for you. So I'll stop there, and then we'll think about 8 years away and 250 years worth celebrating. How do we get there from here? Thank you.
To be exploring Florida from my sailboat on the river. The scene is glorious. Suddenly a Seminole settlement arose on the bank, surrounded by acres of cultivated land, where neatly pruned citrus so proudly stand. From their deer skins the elders arose, there you stand in the water, holding fishing poles, calling out, "Puck Puggy," and waving hello.